Welcome in Amsterdam. This is City Breaks Amsterdam, episode 2, and I'm Marion Jones. I'm calling this episode 5 Walks Around the City. So really, ideas for little wanders, perhaps on your first day to get your bearings, perhaps when you have a spare morning or afternoon, or want to see a part of the city that you may not have time to look at in detail. I'm not going to give a full rundown of every single right and left turn you need to take, but hopefully there will be enough information for you to follow along if you've got a street map with you. They are fairly general get-to-know-the-city sort of walks. I will be talking a little bit about some of the main places that you pass on each one, but in many cases I'll be coming back to them in more detail in future episodes. You might decide to do the same, wander past on the first occasion, or you might decide this is your proper look at a particular part of the city and do some booking ahead so that you can go into the places which I mention. You might then use the ideas as actual walks that you actually do, or maybe you're just listening along in the spirit of let's get to know more about Amsterdam. So, enough of the admin, let's go. I believe the way to express that sentiment in Dutch might be laten we gaan. And the first walk then is a loop of a walk from and back to the Centraal Station, a place worth a look in its own right, and close to some pretty canals, Anne Frank's house, the main square of the city, Dam Square, where you'll pass by the Royal Palace and the oldest and most important church in the Netherlands, not to mention some pretty good shopping and eating opportunities, and then loop back to the station. So yes, Centraal Station. Not well named in my humble opinion, because it's not very central. It's on the edge of the city, backing onto the North Sea coast. But it definitely is one of the most impressive buildings in the whole of the city. 400-metre-long facade, dating from the end of the 19th century, and designed by the Dutch architect Pierre Cuyp. It really is quite a structure. Looks like a palace, really, with its turrets and its clock tower and its plethora of ornamental details, stone relief against the red brick. You will surely want to have a look and take some photos. And the other thing you could do is pop inside and find one of the classiest cafes in Amsterdam, in fact, one of the classiest railway cafes anywhere in the world. Not least because it's made in a room which used to be the old first-class waiting room. It's not that easy to find it in such a large station, but if you go in through the main entrance, turn very much to the right and find the staircase over in the corner, go up there to the first floor, and there you are. Definitely a good place to stop off for coffee or for meals, because you can then enjoy the Art Nouveau touches, the archways, the potted plants, the stained glass. I definitely recommend. And then once you finally finish with the station, I would suggest a little canal loop down Bruwersgracht, which you'll find a couple of streets west of the station, then left into Keizersgracht, down past Anne Frank's house, back up to the station via Dam Square. So, a bit of detail. Bruwersgracht, which actually means Brewer's Canal, was built in the Dutch Golden Age, the 17th century, when money was flooding in, and it has been called the prettiest canal in Amsterdam, although in fact I have seen that description for one or two others too. Anyway, it certainly is very photogenic and pretty, and it leads along to the Keizersgracht, the widest canal in the inner city, one of those 3 main canals that hang down in a loop from and back to the station. It's residential these days, but it's lined with former warehouses and former merchants' mansions. Look out particularly for number 672, which is known as the Museum van Loon, a canal house preserved in its original 17th century state, which is now a museum, so you can get inside and have a good look round. You can get out at the back too and see the Louis XIV garden with its garden house and its coach house. All very typical of what the wealthiest Amsterdammers built themselves in the 17th century. From there you can make your way down to Anne Frank's house, another canal-side house, now a museum. It's got a big new facade built on the front actually. And here you most definitely can't decide to just pop in on the spur of the moment. If you want to visit the museum and tour around the secret annex where Anne Frank and her family hid during World War II, then you most definitely need to book ahead. In fact, you need to do that well in advance of your trip. Otherwise, you're quite likely to find that visiting won't be possible. From here, you need to head eastwards, perhaps via Raadhuisstraat, and find Dam Square. which, unlike the Centraal Station, really is the centre of the city. Not least because it's the place where the original dam was built in the 13th century, thus where the city was founded. Today you'll find the Royal Palace there. Not that it always was a royal palace. It was built in the 17th century to be a city hall. It was a few years later, in 1806, when Louis Napoleon, brother of Napoleon, who had been designated King of the Netherlands by his brother, elected to move in and convert it to a royal palace. If you go and visit today, you can still see the Empire-style decorations which he brought with him, even though he only ruled for a decade or so. Later Dutch monarchs weren't quite so regal about things. They did use the palace sometimes, but eventually in 1936 it became state property. It is still used for royal events, receptions for important guests, award ceremonies, that sort of thing, but on the days when it's not needed for those things, it's open to the public. Also on Dam Square, another very important institution, I don't quite know how to pronounce it in Dutch, Nieuwe Kerk, maybe? New Church. Originally built around 1400, and it has the status really of a national church, the place where Dutch monarchs are inaugurated, including the current king, Willem-Alexander, and before him his mother, Queen Beatrix, and going a little further back, Queen Wilhelmina and her mother, Queen Juliana. If you go inside, you will surely be impressed by the very elaborate altar, the arched nave, the tombs of a number of very famous Dutch people from the past. Outside again in the square is also the Dutch War Memorial, built in memory of Dutch soldiers and members of the resistance who died in World War II, and all around you the atmosphere of a bustling square, street entertainers, musicians, not infrequently a demonstration or two, and quite a lot of shopping and eating opportunities. The fanciest one would be Bijenkorf, the city's oldest department store, with, by the way, a nice restaurant on the top floor, not particularly expensive, somewhere where you can have coffee or a meal or anything in between, and where, if you're lucky, you may get a window seat so that you can enjoy whatever you've bought looking down over the square. There's a very upmarket shopping precinct called Magna Plaza just nearby, so really plenty of choice of things to visit and look at. Eventually then, you can wend your way from there back towards the station, perhaps via Warmoestraat, and take a look at the area between the square and the station, which are some of the oldest streets in Amsterdam, quite narrow, medieval origins, the part of the city where things get rather dubious at night. So that's the first walk then. And for the second, I propose another loop, this time from and back to the flower market, which you are surely going to want to see. This walk will take in a number of canals, the 9 Streets area, which is famous for shopping, and a couple of, how can I put it, canal-based attractions, namely the Canal Museum and the Houseboat Museum. So start at the flower market, or the Bloemenmarkt, as I believe it's called in Dutch, which has been here on the Single Canal since 1860. If you look carefully, you'll notice that some of the stalls are actually houseboats, and it's an atmospheric place to wander and look at flowers, 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 especially tulips. You can buy some if you wish, or buy some bulbs to take home, or if it's other sorts of souvenir, think wooden clogs, wooden tulips, lots of cheese, then you'll find plenty of stalls and shops offering those things too. After the flower market, go up the Herengracht, which is considered the most important canal in the city, another 17th century number, the place where the richest merchants and the most influential citizens used to live, still today a prestigious address. And while enjoying a wander down, do look out for number 386, the Canal Museum, which actually I found a lot more fascinating than it might sound. It's multimedia. You can have headphones in English, which will take you past artists' impressions of old Amsterdam, into a meeting where you can pretend you're in the 17th century discussing what canals should be built and where, then onto a building site where one of the new canals is being dug out and the canal houses are being put up, and finally into a room where a model canal house stands in the centre and you can peep into every room. The whole thing takes about 45 minutes, I think, and you really end up with a much better idea of how the city came into being. After the canal house, you could find the 9 Streets area, perhaps by taking a left into Volvenstraat, and explore the little 3x3 grid of streets and canals, where you'll find lots of boutiques and speciality shops. Think vintage, fashion, foodie havens, and at least one speciality stroopwafel shop with an enormous queue outside. If you take a left onto Prinsengracht, you can start working your way back towards the flower market, looking out for number 296 Prinsengracht, because on the canal just opposite it is moored the Houseboat Museum, an authentic barge built in 1914, originally a working boat, but which was converted to a houseboat in, I think, the 1960s, and you can have a good look round the living quarters and the captain's quarters, discover the history of the boat, see pictures of the various people who've lived and worked on it, and generally get an insight into yet another aspect of Amsterdam life. From there, it's not far back to the flower market, although you might decide on a little detour first to Leidersplein, another of the city's main squares, a centre of entertainment and nightlife, the site, for example, of the city's main theatre, of other theatres and pubs and restaurants, of street musicians and entertainers, the place to see fire-eating, juggling, etc. Well worth a detour before you make your way back to the flower market. Walk number 3 starts at the Rembrandtsplein and makes its way down one of the city's prettiest canals to the main market, the Albert Cuyp market. That would be more of a one-way walk, but you could easily turn it into a loop by turning round and coming back up the canal in the opposite direction. Definitely pretty enough to do that. So, Rembrandtsplein then, one of the city's central squares, again cafes and restaurants on all 4 sides, although not particularly oldie-worldy. It does have a history. It was the butter market, or Botermarkt, in the 17th century, with its own weigh house and autumn fairs for dancing and circus entertainers and whatnot. It was renamed in 1876 when the Rembrandt statue was moved here, and that does definitely dominate the square these days. And off to one side, a small square construction with giant copies of some of Rembrandt's famous paintings on each side. So, from there, find the Reguliersgracht, another very pretty little canal, which is handy because it goes south and crosses over the 3 main canals, the Herengracht, the Keizersgracht and the Prinsengracht, as it goes. When you get to the corner of the Herengracht, you are standing on something called the Brug van 15 Bruggen, which means the bridge of 15 bridges, because if you look in the various directions, you will see 15 bridges. Actually, I think it's 14 because they're counting the one you stand on, but still, quite a sight. A little corner which I saw described somewhere as the most romantic spot in Amsterdam. When you get to the corner of the Prinsengracht, see if you can spot a house with a big stork statue on the roof. Put there because this house used to belong to a midwife who had her practice actually in that building, and a nice reminder of a Dutch custom even still today of displaying a stork in the window of a house where a baby has just been born. Follow the canal right to its end, and from there it's just a short hop to Albert Cuyp Market, a long street market all along Albert Cuyp Straat, more than 100 years old, over 250 stands, some very snazzy street art at one end, a large portrait of Rembrandt, who else? And along the road then all kinds of stalls, mainly food, vegetables, spices, lots of snack carts, the sort of place where you really need to go a-browsing and see what you can find. Things I spotted included a large rack of very orange football shirts, emblazoned with the names of famous Dutch players, a shop selling more varieties of licorice than you would think possible, and a fabric store where you could buy rolls of material printed with canal house print. Very cosmopolitan in atmosphere, also in the food sorts that you can buy there, so there was stroopwafel and herring, there were Vietnamese takeaway stands. There was even a stall with I don't know how many different varieties of cannabis lollies. When you finished at the market, you could retrace your route back to Rembrandtsplein, or you could decide to go a little east and find the Amstel River, turn left up that, and follow it up back towards Rembrandtsplein. So, after 3 canal-based walks, on to something a little bit different, and for number 4, I'd suggest a wander round Museum Quarter, where you will find, among other things, 4 of the city's best-known art galleries, the city's concert hall, and the biggest, most beautiful park, the Vondelpark. I haven't really got a route to suggest. I think you just need a map, and then to wander between whichever of those things interest you. So, to go through them, the Rijksmuseum, the other massive and very beautiful building designed by the architect Cuyp, sort of a twin to the Central Station really, so more Gothic turrets, more red brick and white stone decorative features, and, bizarrely, a cycle lane right through the middle of the building. It is home to 1 million objects, not all of them on display at once, and the main feature for most people will be the collection of paintings from the Dutch Golden Age, and handily, a lot of them are grouped close together in something called the Gallery of Honour up on the first floor. It's nice to visit anyway because there's a lovely hall outside with stained glass depictions of famous Dutch people, Rembrandt, of course, other artists, merchants, and in the big gallery just off to the side you will find a significant collection of paintings by the old Dutch masters, the ones who date from the Golden Age. So Rembrandt's Night Watch is the highlight, along with the Vermeer paintings you probably know, the Milkmaid, the Love Letter, and so on. And although I suspect that many people stop there, just look at that gallery, there is lots more which you could look at in the rest of the museum. There's some Van Gogh somewhere else, although of course he has his own museum too. There's a big collection of Delft china, a collection of those beautiful dolls' houses which wealthy Amsterdam families collected during the Golden Age. There's a recreation of a canal house rim, again from the 17th century. And if you want to venture beyond Dutch homegrown culture, there's lots of wonderful Asian stuff too, from China, from Indonesia, Japan, Vietnam. As with all these big museums, you could spend days there. You're probably best to think out in advance what your focus is. Quite a bit smaller but equally significant is the Van Gogh Museum, the world's largest collection on his life and work. About 200 paintings, 500 drawings, lots of his letters, the highlights being various sunflower pictures, the potato eaters, the bedroom in Arles, the wheat field with crows. There's work too by some of his contemporaries, Gauguin, Toulouse-Lautrec for example, and also by artists whom he admired. There are 2 other art galleries which I really ought to mention too, the Stedelik Museum, which introduces itself on its website as, quote, the place where everyone can discover and experience modern and contemporary visual art and design. Originally in a 19th century building, but with a big new wing opened in 2012, which is worth a look even if you're not going inside. Here's the website again. Its form surprises the visitor as it looks like a huge bathtub with the main entry to the museum located underneath between the bathtub's legs. The building's form bluntly violates its beautiful neighbourhood, the old Stedelik building, the Concertgebouw, the Van Gogh Museum and the Rijksmuseum. Its permanent connection starts from about 1870, so it covers Impressionism and the things which came afterwards, Fauvism, Cubism, Expressionism. There's a Dutch photography collection there, sections on Dutch design and furniture, and, I'm quoting again, an interesting collection of European and American trends in art since 1950, as works of Matisse, Picasso, Newman, Rauschenberg and Warhol. More modern again is the MOCO, M-O-C-O, which stands for Modern and Contemporary Art. We offer, they say, an unparalleled collection of art to reflect on modern society, and it's the place to find Banksy or Damien Hirst or Andy Warhol. Also down here is the Concertgebouw, so the city's main concert venue, home to the Royal Concert Orchestra, the Dutch Philharmonic Orchestra, the Dutch Chamber Orchestra, and a place with a year-round programme. Lots of classical music for sure, but also everything else you can think of. Jazz, pop, music events for families, special events. They are quite big on drawing people in, so hundreds of concerts a year, including Sunday morning events, Saturday matinees, Wednesday lunchtimes. If you do want to get inside and attend a concert, there certainly is plenty to choose from. And then finally, down in this area, you should check out the Vondelpark. 47 hectares of garden and ponds and lawns and statues, an open-air theatre, bike paths, cafes, a bronze statue of Just van den Vondel, whom I've seen described as the greatest writer in the Dutch language. He was a poet and a playwright, living at the same time as Rembrandt and Shakespeare, although one has to note not nearly as well known, at least outside Holland, as either of them. And you'll come across all sorts of other things, for example, an abstract concrete fish donated to the park for its centenary in 1965 by one Pablo Picasso. You could just go to wander or relax, or you could check out the open-air theatre, known as the Openluchttheater, where there are free performances, music and theatre, all throughout the summer. Pretty popular, I think, so prepare for it to be quite crowded. Moving on then to the fifth walk, around the Plantage district, so starting in the Jewish quarter and taking in the city zoo and botanical gardens. A good place to start would be the Waterlooplein, which is another transport hub and market, and the route I'm going to suggest will take you past the Rembrandt House, through the Jewish quarter, and then on to the gardens in the zoo. The Waterlooplein, the oldest flea market in the Netherlands, some 300 stalls of vintage fashion, all sorts of artefacts, books, lots of food trucks, the sort of place where you could wander for a whole morning if vintage markets are your thing. And it's open, I believe, every day bar Sunday. It's not too far from there to the Jordenbriestraat, where at number 4 you will find the 17th century house in which Rembrandt lived and worked for about 20 years. Interesting then just to see the outside, or indeed to go in, where you'll find lots of rooms and information about him, and a replica of his studio. Do look out just opposite the building for something called the Café de Sluiswacht, which is a cafe made from a former lockkeeper's house. Very crowded at popular times of day, but worth going in if you can, to admire the old stone floor, the wooden benches, the ceiling beams, and to sit with river views, or indeed over the river on the terrace which juts out over the water. This area is the beginning of the Jewish quarter, much of which was destroyed in World War II, but where nevertheless there are still things of interest to look at, not least the Jewish Museum, built in a former Ashkenazi synagogue, and chock full of information on Jewish history and religion and culture. A couple of minutes' walk away is the Portuguese synagogue, built in the 1670s, a decade in which there was a whole influx of Jews from Portugal and other countries, all fleeing persecution and coming to Amsterdam, where they hoped they would be able to settle and live in peace. The Portuguese synagogue is still a working synagogue, but it is open to visitors, and definitely worth a visit. The magnificent interior of the main synagogue looks pretty much as it did 300 years ago, with its towering stone columns, vaulted timber ceiling, wooden pews, massive Torah ark, and enormous brass chandeliers. The services are lit not by electricity, but by hundreds and hundreds of candles. In fact, it is possible occasionally to go to a candlelit concert held inside, something which I imagine would be truly stunning. If you then walk a little further east, away from the city centre, you will come to the Hortus Botanicus, which is Latin for botanical gardens, and this one of the oldest in the world, was founded in 1638, so again during the Golden Age, and today a place where you can visit the palm house, the butterfly house, the orangery, and a whole network of flower beds and lawns and little statues. Here too is the wonderfully named Natura Artis Magistra, shortened these days simply to Artis, and the name of Amsterdam's city zoo. Opened in 1838, so again one of the first zoos in the world, and another option if it's a spot of R&R you seek in the city centre. Just before I finish, I really ought to mention a couple of other ways of seeing Amsterdam, not on foot, but by transport. So there's a City Sightseeing Amsterdam hop-on, hop-off bus system. You can buy a 24-hour ticket or a 48 one, and I think once you've got the ticket you can do both routes if you want. They both begin and end at, where else, the Centraal Station, which is in fact also the best place to begin a boat trip. Perhaps even just before or after you do the first walk suggested on this episode, the one that starts and finishes at the Centraal Station. I'll put the links for companies which offer both of those things into the show notes and also onto the blog post. If you're newish to City Breaks, you may not know that there's a blog post to go with every episode on our website, www.citybreakspodcast.co.uk, where you will find a summary of everything that was said, links to all the places that were mentioned, often some further reading ideas, and definitely some photographs. So do have a look if any of that sounds of interest. For the moment then, that's the end of the 5 walks idea. So I'll just mention briefly that the next episode, episode 3, is going to centre on the canals. A little bit of history and atmosphere on the canals themselves, the canal-side houses, the boats and the bridges, and a rundown of 3 or 4 places which you can visit to find out more. So I hope very much that you'll be able to join me for that. For the moment then, just remains to say, in Dutch if I can manage it, thank you very much, dank u wel, and goodbye. Tot ziens.